care for them increase as well. The increase in inmate population has resulted in an increase in the size of the department. Back when I started, we had 9 prisons in the system. It's important to note that the department has increased staffing consistent with the rise in inmate population, and our staff to inmate ratio has remained consistent for the past 15 years. The growth in our inmate population has more been towards Part 2 or less serious offenders and parole violators being admitted back into the system. There is no indication that this rate of growth will be reduced. Over the last 6 years, the non-violent Part 2 offenders increased 49%. We just want to put that in perspective when we start talking about our legislative initiatives as well. And the percentage rate from 2005 to 2007 was 4%. In 2008, we had a parole moratorium, and we spiked at a 7% growth. And we're down a little bit in 2010, and part of that was, may be related to the significant growth we had in 2008, when we had a bubble of inmates in the system that weren't being paroled. Let's move on to the next slide. Inmate population projections. As you can see, we're showing an increase in the next few years. Part of our population projection increase is that under Act 42, which was passed a few years back, the inmates who are currently receiving a 2 to 5 year maximum sentence, the judge has an option to place the confinement of those inmates in the State Department of Corrections or in county prisons. In November of this year, the judge will lose that discretion unless the county jail is operating at less than 110% of capacity. If they are over that, the inmates must be sent to the state prison system. And there are varied projections on how many inmates that we're going to receive. Right now we have a committee working with the counties to define capacity. So we're using a base across all of the state of Pennsylvania's county jails. But we do expect a minimum of 1,200 inmates to be, come to the department in the first year. And that number could reach 2,000, and that's based on how the counties define capacity. We also, as we said, expect the continued increase in the short-term offenders, the Part 2 violent offenders. We have taken some steps to, through parole centers, which we've hope to reduce our population by approximately 1,000 inmates, or reduce the growth in our population by that 1,000 inmates. And those started back in May of this year, where technical parole violators are returned to prison for only a very short time, sent back out to the community correction centers for this purpose, and spend 90 to 120 days there rather than the 14 to 16 months they would be sitting in state prison. Nonetheless, with the actions taken by the department, we still expect the population to grow. We are taking a two-pronged approach to public safety. The first is legislative action. This action is aimed at creating and expanding effective means of reducing crime and victimization. And second, we continue to add to our capacity, and we're aiming to provide sufficient capacity while maintaining safe and secure facilities. The department has proposed legislative action aimed at creating programs to reduce crime and victimization, largely through inmate treatment programs designed to reduce recidivism. And We'll move on to the next slide. Our legislative action is looking at long-term solutions for combating crime, enhancing public safety, and prioritizing criminal justice resources. In the last few years, there have been a few bills passed. Act 81 established a triple RI sentence where place of confinement, all 2 to 5. Well, that's a different item. Well, Act 81 that had the triple RI also is the act that provided that place of confinement that I mentioned earlier, where the 2 to 5s from the counties would actually come to the state. Also, our SIP program allowed DOC to go back to court for eligible offenders to be reconsidered, and we still work on that to increase the numbers in that program. Act 95, which I mentioned earlier, was the diversion of the technical parole violators. There's a current bill in the legislature, Senate Bill 100, that would, if enacted through the various stakeholders that were at a meeting recently, had believed that we could reduce population by about 2,000 inmates if that legislation was passed. That legislation is looking at our Part 2 type offenders. You know, none of this legislation we're talking about is letting violent offenders out early. Nothing is, you know, looking at that. We're looking basically at the nonviolent Part 2 and Part 2 type offenders. Some of those Part 2s might be considered violence, but they would not be included in with the inmates that we're looking at to reduce. This, and frankly, with what the governor is looking at for the department, our resources have grown exponentially. You know, I started many years ago, and obviously we've become a bigger system. As I mentioned, we started out, we had a budget of less than $100 million when I started. Through all our different programs, appropriations, etc., we're closing in on $2 billion. And as we keep sending more inmates to prison, obviously you need places to handle them, and you need the resources in order to handle them and maintain safe, secure prisons. So the next area that I want to talk about is our capacity expansion. First thing I want to start out with before mentioning what we're doing in terms of adding beds are we're in the process right now of returning the inmates from Michigan back to Pennsylvania. By the end of this month, all the inmates that are in Michigan will be returned to Pennsylvania. Governor's budget calls for the return of the inmates from Virginia in next fiscal year. We have a date which I'm not going to mention because we want to make sure of putting out a date that we're certain that we have the capacity up and running to handle those additional inmates back in Pennsylvania. And up until that time, we also have to give a 6-month notice, so we'll that decision will have to be coming, you know, in the next few months. But we always like to keep up, look at our trends, make sure they're going where we think they're going, and bring on the capacity, you know, as we need them. On this slide here, we're talking about our modular and capitally constructed units. Over the next 2 slides, we have basically 1,200 beds. I won't read all these to you. You can see them on the slide, but we have 1,200 beds coming in that are L2 beds in modular housing units. Why these L2 beds are important is because I mentioned earlier that we have our significant part of our growth has been in Part 2 offenders, and a lot of them are what we call short minimum inmates that are basically returning to the system. We really don't even have enough time at present to even provide their programming, in the time frame that they should be getting out and being diverted. So that's being evaluated. Legislation, may help that. But those L2 beds, and also a number of the inmates returning from out of state, those inmates were pretty much cherry-picked to go out of state. They were minimums, lower medians, they did not include certain health care restrictions, etc. Those other two states, got, I wouldn't say the best of the best, but whatever that might mean in a prison setting, but they did get they did have a number of restrictions of who we could send in. So our cost probably per inmate might have jumped up a little bit because of that, because we had to provide, the health care. We'd provide the health care to those with the highest need, but now we had less inmates, to factor that cost figure over. In addition to those 1,200 beds, we have approximately 800 beds that are in our traditional design housing unit that are built with capital funds. You can move on to the next slide. And those would be the non-L2 units that are listed on the slides of the one previous to that. Those 4 units, what you can see with these numbers are some of these units are close to being ready at this point in time. As a matter of fact, one, Rockviews, which was on the previous page, but you don't need to turn back to that, was listed for August 2011. Our anticipation when we sent the termination notice out to Michigan is that the contract would be terminated in August and they'd wait till the end to maximize the money coming into their state, but they did not do that. They realized that they didn't want inmates who knew they weren't going to be staying there for a much longer period of time, or their staff who would be in a mode that were closing down the facility, so they decided that they want to move those back as quickly as possible to Pennsylvania. We have a few closed units within our system that we've reopened at the Greensboro, Laurel Highlands, Crescent, and there is the housing unit at Rockview that we're pushing forward to open and to ensure that we have sufficient room to bring these inmates back to Pennsylvania, and we are doing that right now. Also in our capacity program are new prisons. The new prison at Benner Township, which is on the grounds of Rockview, will have 2,000 inmates. That prison, right now they're working on it. Deputy Klopotowski was up there recently. It relates me to 350 construction workers on site, and the prison is going up very quickly, and we expected to have it done late next calendar year. Our current plans are to open that in December of 2012. If things go as well as they're going now construction-wise. The other new prison that we have going on, this slide comes from the budget presentation, so there's a little change in some of this. It's listed as Graterford East and Graterford West. They're now Eagleview, which is one word, East, and Eagleview West, which are being built on the grounds of, or will be built on the grounds of the current Graterford prison. We have reissued the request for proposal for that, so there'll be a little bit of delay from the dates that are listed there of July 2014 to now December 2014 or January 2015, which is more likely the time frame that those two prisons, which will share a number of services, will be built and ready to be opened. We do plan to close Graterford at that time. We are going to mothball it. And so the net growth of Graterford, which would have, of Eagleview, which would have 4,100 beds, we would lose 3,000 beds on the decommissioning of Graterford. So there's a net of 1,100 beds that we would be getting at that time. The last item is community corrections. The budget is listing 225 additional beds. That's not quite accurate. It is that that's the funding, except